The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection with Al Page.
Our guest is Juan Williams, a reporter for the Washington Post.
What's the difference between being a bad reporter and a good reporter?
Well, you know, the whole concept of news has changed so radically just in my lifetime. When I was born in 1954 and looked at the newspapers in my hometown, which was New York City, typically what news was news of the president or news of the world, you know, conversations between world leaders. And today, if you look at newspapers, really news is a far wider spectrum of events. You have news of women, news of blacks, you have news about events in the world in terms of science, in terms of the environment. It just goes on and on. It's much wider. Now, the difference then between a good reporter and a bad reporter is a reporter who is able to understand context. You can have your child go down the street acting as eyes and ears and say, "Daddy, a car hit another car." Well, that's a story, I suppose, but it's not much of a story. What you want from that reporter is someone who can say, "I went down to the corner, there was an accident, a blue car hit a red car, it was a Ford hitting a Chevy, one person was hurt, the person was not badly hurt," and you want them to tell you, if possible, who was at fault, were the police there, did an ambulance come? That, or the rest of that, is what makes the good story. It's the details. And the same is true of good writing, I might add. That good writing is a function of people who are able to perceive details and context. So that's the difference. That's what makes a good reporter versus a bad one. Bad ones, you know, they'll tell you something happened, but you come away not understanding the fullness of the situation. You come away thinking, well, that's all that happened. There was an accident at the corner, and not understanding the human dimensions, the drama, the tensions that existed.
Are you a good reporter?
At this point, at 35, I think I'm a very good reporter. I think that I am not finished, though, in terms of becoming a master of my craft.
In particular, what are you working on, and what areas would you like to improve upon?
Well, I think I have a very good eye. I think I can be the child at the corner who can see things. And I think I am also very good now at understanding context and flavor and details. I'm still at the point, though, where organizing the structure of that story is a challenge for me. How do I tell the story in journalistic detail in such a way that will both captivate and inform my audience? That is still a major challenge for me. Still something that when I sit down at the computer or the typewriter to work with, I really invest myself in, because I feel myself getting better but still struggling.
When you're doing a story, when you're trying to get organized, do you feel that you're objective in the way that you get organized?
Well, you have to, first of all, in your own mind, understand that there are different levels of the game. In journalism, there are the stories that you read on the front page of your paper every day, which should be anyway, straight news stories that say X event happened, the president made a speech, the prime minister said, or whatever. Then you go down the way and you can have news analysis, which is to say, we reported yesterday or today that the president, prime minister said X, Y, Z. Here's what we think is also going on, and this is kind of a news analysis by the reporter on the scene. Then you have pieces that are done by columnists and editorial writers. Now, the columnist is a personal opinion. It's something that he's thought through, maybe some information he has or a conversation he's had with a world leader. Then you have editorials, which should be the voice of the paper, and try to take a more institutional look at the way things are going in terms of certain set of principles that are held to firmly by that editorial board. And then you have magazine pieces, which is principally what I do now, large magazine pieces and columns. And in the magazine piece, there you have an attitude. The writer takes an attitude. He's interested in a specific view of this event and looks for support for his thesis and offers in the telling of the story support for his point of view.
How do you take this point of view? Do you look outside of yourself each time and say, Juan, am I looking at this objectively? Is this a reasonable point of view?
Oh, absolutely. You have to be rigorous with yourself. Otherwise, I don't think the reader really is going to take you seriously. You have to say, as you go into a project, I think this may be what's going on. It's the reason that I'm coming to this project or subject with my interest and intelligence and antenna out. But the fact is, I don't know what's going on, and I'm going to go in here and attempt to be honest. I'm going to go in here and try to find out what's going on. And then, once I've found out what's going on, I'm going to try to explain what's going on, first to myself, but then to my readers. And the way to do this is through a certain perspective. It may be, for instance, that you go into a war situation, and you can report daily on which bombs have fallen, who has been killed, the number killed, etc. But at some point you say, this is a tragedy. How best to convey the magnitude of the horror here? And maybe you decide that the way to do it, the best way to do it, is to tell it through the eyes of the children on the ground and the lives of those children, how they've been affected. And then you have to really go to work in terms of reporting, in terms of understanding the lives of children in a war situation. That's what I'm talking about when I said the various levels of the game. And I think that in the journalism game, magazine writing may be the height of the craft.
Do you know whether you're covering all sides of the story? Do you care? Do you have an obligation to cover all sides of the story?
Absolutely. There can be no doubt that in journalism, fairness to all sides in any story is required. You must be fair.
But isn't fairness subjective?
Well, I don't think so. I think that if I give you a chance to have your say, if I fully represent your views, then you might say later on to me, you know, I didn't like your conclusions in your piece, or I didn't like the way that you conveyed my opinion and my position, but I don't think you could say that I had been unfair to you. And I think that also to the reader, fairness is that the reader has a sense of what both sides are in this argument, confrontation, accident, whatever. It's just required. Now, let me just add that in a magazine piece or in a column, it's not always the case that fairness requires that the opposite position be laid out in the column. What's required is that the columnist, the editorial writer, the reporter do the work and have an understanding of the opposite point of view and factor that into the writing. It may not be the case that you come to a section of the piece and it says, here is the opposing point of view to argue with what I've been saying. Maybe it's now simply incorporated into the body of the piece so that you have a sense that the writer is in total command of the material, that the writer knows the material. He knows the pro, he knows the con, and he's willing, absolutely willing, to be open to it, but he feels that he's got an answer that's larger than the pro-con debate.
When do you know you have enough stuff in your head to sit down and write the piece?
Well, in a sense, your editors come along with a hammer and start hammering on your head and say, we want that damn piece now. You've been working on it long enough. But as a writer, you know what happens is you have a sense of the project. And this is something that really rankles me as a writer, because I'll have a sense of the amount of time I want to spend with a specific project. And it may be that the dang thing doesn't obey my precepts, that it may be that it requires more time, and it also may be that it doesn't require as much time, that less time is needed. But what happens is that because I was trained as a street reporter, first and foremost, going back now 15 years, I keep sucking up the details like a vacuum. And at some point, then my brain has to say to me, stop.
Enough.
Stop, stop, stop. Now this is a dangerous thing because in part, you never have enough detail. What you're trying to do is be God's eye. What you're trying to do is see it all. And having seen it all, then decide what is the most important, what patterns exist, what trends exist, and then tell the reader, here is the pattern, here is the trend, here is what's really going on. So you always want to keep your eyes and ears open. On the other hand, at some point you've got to say, cut, that's it. Now go home with what you've got and mold it into the piece. Craft the piece of writing that's going to absolutely grip and inform your reader.
Can you do that as a first draft? Does it just flow easily once you've told yourself, stop thinking about it, just do it?
No, it almost never does. Sometimes you'll have a happy day and a happy event will happen where it just flies out. What happens with me is I first over-report and then secondly overwrite. I will write the piece out in such detail and give so much room to every idea and concept that I overdo it. And what's required of me then is to go back, look at this draft that's too long, too in-depth, too detailed, and again, put it through some kind of of mesh so that things start to fall out that aren't absolutely essential, so that maybe a section I have in there where I'm going into great detail, maybe I can get by just a little explanatory paragraph on that, because otherwise the reader could get bogged down. You have to understand, you've also got an obligation to make sure that the piece is sufficiently well paced in its writing that the reader gets through it. I don't know about you, but I know that in my life, as I pick up magazines and newspapers, most pieces, I never come to the end of them. I simply start them. Now, the reason for that is a failure in the part of the writing and the writer. They have not done a good job of pacing that piece so that I understand it, and they have lost my attention. So ideally, what I as a writer want to do is pace that piece so that you don't put it down, so that when the kid says to you, "Hey, Dad, can you fix my laces, or my bike chain just slipped off?" you say, "Hey, kid, wait a second, I'm reading something. I'll be with you in 5 minutes. I want to finish this piece."
So you want to be seamless from paragraph to paragraph.
You want to get into the flow. You really want to. That's right. Seamlessness is your goal. But more than that, compelling seamlessness. It's not that it simply be facile writing, you know, like ads or something. It'd be writing that grips you because it's got your imagination. You are emotionally drawn into this. You feel the compelling nature of what happened. It's the difference between the kid on the corner saying, "Dad, there was an accident," and the kid on the corner saying, "Dad, I saw an accident today, and a woman was leaning over, blood dripping from her lip, and I couldn't tell what was happening, but the lady next door said she thought there was internal hemorrhaging." And now you're really gripped. Now you know what the hell happened to that woman. Was she dying? Was she hemorrhaging? All that. The idea is that a story can be told in such a way as to fascinate you. You know, ideally what you want to do in any journalism is not journalism. What you want to do is create a fictional tale. You want to have all the devices of the fiction writer at your disposal.
Now you've got this nice draft, you've got this wonderful, seamless, gripping drama, and you've discovered that God has created an editor.
Well, I bring the editors in before that. I mean, you know, the best editing is done before a writer ever picks up the pen, before the pen hits the paper, because the editor is talking to you. You're talking to the editor, and the editor is talking with you.
Now give us more of that. What might an editor be saying to you?
Well, let's take an example. An editor might say to me, let's say doing a piece about the president, and the editor says to me, "Well, why do you want to do this piece about the president? We read about the president every day. We've got people over at the White House who are doing pieces about the president. Why do you want to do a piece?" And so, you know, you have to give him some rationalization. It could be that I want to do a piece about how the Iran-Contra scandal, for all that we know and have read about it, still hovers over this presidency like a shadow scandal. You know, and everyone kind of waits daily to see if anything more is going to come out or any subsequent trial is going to be started. What could happen with this? Will this be a bombshell that could affect this man's presidency? Something like that. And you say, well, okay, he says, well, you've got the nugget of idea there, but do you think that you can report that out? And if you do, who would you talk to? How would you shape that? So now you and the editor are involved in a conspiracy. You're shaping the piece beforehand.
You're co-opting the editor?
That's right. Well, you're selling. It's like a little bit like a salesman at the door. He says, why don't you buy this piece, Mr. Editor? And so you're working here with the piece. And then you come back after various reporting assignments for the piece, and again, you're reporting what information you found out, new perceptions you have. The editor's working with you throughout that. Now, there's a certain point at which you have to break off from the editor, and you have to say, this is my piece. This is what I'm going to say. This is what I want to do. And therefore, you go off and you really write it by yourself. You suffer that pain all to your own, but at the same time, you've had a partner in crime, the editor, ideally way before you start handing in a final draft.
Let's change the subject for the moment. Is it your impression that we're mainly covering bad news when we're covering stories?
Well, Ben Bradley, who's the executive editor here, says we don't cover every plane that successfully lands, but if one of them crashes, let us know. I think that's the attitude of newspapers. That's what journalism is in some sense. It's really not covering the ordinary. So many things, I mean, happen ordinarily in the course of life. The elevator doesn't get stuck. Your child successfully gets to the ice cream truck and back in the house. That you don't, these are not the things that we find compelling. What we find compelling are where things don't work and then trying to resolve them, a resolution to a problem. That's just the basic tenet of any drama, of any play, of any work of fiction, is that tension. But the same is true in journalism. You're looking for points of tension, you're looking for points of conflict, you're looking for confrontation.
But if we're emphasizing the plane crashes, the points of tension, does the reader eventually assume that life has more of these events than in fact really occur?
Well, I think that's true. I know my parents live in New York, and if you lived in New York and listened to the news every night, I think you wouldn't want to go out the door because they have murder after murder. And then if you actually look at the statistics, New York is not much worse than other cities in the country in terms of the number of people who live there and the number of murders that occur. But you're right, you can get from the newspapers or from the television this overwhelming sense that everything is bad, that the world is a bad place. And I think that's a mistake. What you have to do is really try to dig beneath it. And that's what I look for, I might say, when I read a story or when I look at a television news story. I look for the reporter or the commentator who's really going a little bit farther beneath the surface. Because if you stay on the surface, well, there are going to be murders in every town every day, and if you just start piling them up, well, it can be overwhelming and negative. What you want is a piece or a person, in terms of the reporting, that gives you that wider context I was talking about at the start, and also gives you a sense that there's a broader world where, you know, today children sang and birds flew and it was a nice day.
Let's change the subject once again. Is the amount of coverage that minorities receive in the press sufficient?
Well, now this is a tough one because, again, if you look back just 30 years in American journalism, minorities were getting almost no coverage in terms of the major white dailies. Well, they had black newspapers, but in terms of the big newspapers, white-owned, you got no coverage of blacks. I mean, there are stories about blacks being told that there's a rule if we write an obituary about a black, we just call her Miss Sarah if it's a woman, you know, or Sam if it's a man, or if there's a fire and then 5 people are killed and it turns out that there were 5 black people, well, no news. If it was 5 whites, we've got a front page story. That kind of attitude was pervasive. Today you see much more coverage of blacks. You see black people in the paper as officials. You see stories about the plight of blacks as a minority and as a disadvantaged minority. Now, that's problematic because, for instance, the guy you're talking to obviously is not a poor person, but he's black. Now, coverage of me as a middle-class black person becomes very difficult. It's almost like that's an invisible kind of black person. Or if you look at the idea of blacks as simply representative of people who are disadvantaged and poor and who suffer tremendous family problems, then suddenly you're stigmatizing blacks because every time you have a poverty story to do, every time you have a story to do about drug abuse or wife beating, you're sending people off to go cover the black community and saying, yeah, well, we do cover blacks. We cover when you beat your wife or you take drugs. Again, a tremendously negative image. So increased coverage doesn't necessarily mean good coverage. And I think we're still struggling to do good coverage of the minority community in this country, and for the most part are not there yet. I think one of the most prevalent grievances is that, you know, when crimes are committed, typically the newspaper or television station will say, and the suspect is a black male. But if the crime was committed by a white male, somehow race doesn't get mentioned. And therefore, the viewer or reader tends to come away after regularly watching that show or reading that newspaper thinking, well, boy, these blacks commit a lot of crimes, you know, disproportionate. And again, you get these negative stereotypes built up by the media.
When we cover minorities, do we tend to focus on the so-called leaders of the minorities as opposed to the people themselves?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. The focus on the leadership in terms of the minority community in the United States also tends to be the case that the media opens their microphones or their notebooks for whoever calls themselves a leader. In other words, if you get a guy like Al Sharpton in New York in that Tawana Brawley situation where the young woman said that there was a rape situation, all that, suddenly Al Sharpton, this guy who was a minister in Brooklyn, leaps into the situation, and he's got a very bombastic air. You know, he's always making outrageous statements, great quotes for the newspapers, and suddenly this guy who's no civil rights leader is suddenly described as civil rights leader or black leader Al Sharpton. It's really incredible, and it's damaging to the sense of community that people who really have no roots in the community, have not really paid their dues or earned that title, that honorific, are suddenly given it by the white press. And it's as if the white press is creating leaders in the black community. But at the same time, I think that what it says to black people is maybe we don't have real leadership, maybe we don't have anybody who could handle the press here. And the ability to handle the press suddenly becomes the determinant of who is a leader, which it should not be. But unfortunately, the fact that, let's say, a Jesse Jackson is great on the stump or in front of a camera becomes as much a part of his significance in terms of black leadership as his ability to get things done.
Is part of the problem that editors don't know how to cover minorities?
Well, I think part of the problem is that the newsroom situation in the country, although much improved, is still not anywhere near adequate in terms of integration, that you have black people in the newsroom who come through, get frustrated. You have a high attrition rate for blacks in major media in this country. They feel as if there's some sort of ceiling on what they can do, how far they can rise in the organization. It's infrequent that you see people in positions of power who are black or female still. And I think that's unfortunate. And the result is that a lot of the attitudes that are conveyed through the press tend to be from the perspective of well-to-do white males. And really, when you see some shift or change in that, it's an argument that's gone on in the newsroom between a black person or maybe just another sensitive person and the leadership about, well, should we tell the story that way, or are we being a little bit insensitive? And of course then, this becomes a trick bag in and of itself, because then you have the leadership, sort of the top of the paper, saying, well, wait a second, we don't want to stir any trouble. Let's stay away from stories about blacks that might be controversial, because we don't want the NAACP or somebody saying we're racist, and that's not going to be good for circulation. It's going to make us look bad, so we don't have to tell that story. So a lot of things just get swept under the rug, and they don't deal with the hard news in the black community that's sometimes negative.
When you go out to cover a minority story, do minorities look upon you as a member of a minority group, or do they just look at you as a reporter?
Well, it depends on the story. I'm pretty well known in Washington, D.C. and some of the other big cities along the East Coast, and so when people see me, they think it's a big story, or they're going to react to me as Juan Williams. Then secondly, they'll react to me as the Washington Post. Now, the Washington Post carries a lot of weight. Obviously, the Washington Post is a major institution. If something breaks as a story in the Washington Post, it's going to have nationwide impact. So people are also very, very aware that I'm from the Washington Post. Now, in the minority community, that of course means that I'm from a big white newspaper, a very powerful white newspaper, and immediately means that there are both some suspicions of me, but also there's the feeling that, my God, this guy is making it in mainstream white America, and there's a little bit of, well, he's doing so well, we've got to like him or honor him or pay attention to him.
Or maybe just tell him a story.
Maybe that's right.
How do you know whether somebody's telling you the truth or not?
Well, you never quite know if someone's telling you the absolute truth. What you have to do is listen to them, be fair to them, give them their say, and then check them out. That's all. I mean, the reporters who don't check them out are the ones who get burned. And you know, the place in a newspaper that you see the most lies, by the way, has got to be the day stories, the stories that are just on the front page from day to day. And the reason is, reporters don't have the time to check out what people are telling them. People tell them whatever they want to tell them. That's why they have a plethora of press agents in this world. You know, they try to spin the story one way or another on a day-to-day basis. They have a harder time spinning the guys who are doing the longer pieces, because those guys can check things out and come to their own conclusions.
Have you been in a situation where you've almost been burned, where you've done the checking and you've had to throw something out?
No, I've never been burned on it, but I certainly have been burned in a different way. Burned in the sense that, you know what, I didn't understand this story because that guy spun me in the wrong direction. That guy told me something as if, so as to make the president or make his senator or whatever look good, and I didn't ask 3 and 4 more questions that would have led me to understand what their real agenda was, what they were really trying to do, what was really at stake in this situation.
As you become more skillful in dealing with these kinds of situations, how do you keep from being more cynical?
Well, you know, cynicism almost isn't the problem, it's arrogance. Because if you're in a situation where you are the writer and you're making judgments, you never want to become sort of self-satisfied that I really know what's going on and you don't, buddy, and I'm going to write what I know is going on. Well, you can't have that kind of arrogance. What you've got to do is say, now that I think I know what you're up to, here's what I think you're up to, why don't you respond to me so that if I'm wrong, you can change my opinion, you can inform me in such a way as to inform my writing and to correct my vision before it becomes fact, black and white on paper. That is the issue, really, arrogance. Cynicism is part of the deal, especially in modern America. You've got press agents, you've got handouts, you know, by the bushel. People are always trying to use the media. Politicians right now use the media with such ease, it's incredible. I think if it was a domestic situation, the neighbors would call the police because it's abusive right now, the way the media gets used by politicians. And for the most part, the press is doing a bad job of responding. But if you look back at the 84, 88 campaigns, what you're seeing really is politicians and their media people on a run. They know how to handle the press. They don't even bother to talk to the press anymore. Basically, they communicate through ads and what they call free TV time, which is the evening news. They are able to put a collar on the print reporters by saying, we don't give you access unless we see that you're doing what we want you to do in some cases.
Have people been as blunt to you as that?
People are never that blunt because they know that you couldn't swallow that too easily. You'd rankle at something like that. But what they do nonetheless is if they find that you aren't exactly going along with them, aren't doing what you want, then suddenly you can't talk to the candidate. You don't have access to the candidate. Or even beforehand, they'll check you out, see what kind of reporter you are, and decide if the kind of story you're likely to do is likely to benefit their candidate. And if it's not, they'll simply say, I'm sorry, he doesn't have time to see you, and hope that that means that you and your editor will back off and not do the story. A story that's not done, in some cases, it's much better than a story that's done that's only a middling story.
We're just about at the end of the interview. Do you like your job? Is it fun?
Oh, boy. You know, when I was a kid growing up, I thought that to be a reporter, to have a press pass, to get to go to ball games, to ask the mayor any question you wanted, it's just the greatest job in the world. And you know what? At 35, it is. It's a tremendous job. It's a wonderful opportunity. It's, to me, the basic question about life in America that I always want to answer, every story I get into, is who has power, how they get it, and how do they exercise it, power. And being a reporter, I'm able to get to the root answers of those questions.
Juan Williams, a reporter for the Washington Post, upon reflection.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.